Courtly love was a game in which the figures of the Tudor court would happily indulge, despite sometimes failing to recognise its pitfalls, one key example being Anne Boleyn herself. But what was courtly love? What were the rituals? Where did it all begin as a concept? Well, to discuss this very topic, I am honoured to have historian, author and broadcaster Sarah Gristwood back onto the podcast for a discussion based on her book, The Tudors in Love. From the origins of courtly love with the troubadours and Eleanor of Aquitaine, back to the legends of Lancelot and Guinevere, courtly love has played a major role in history, defining much about how we approach the stories of people such as Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville and Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley. So settle in and join Sarah and I as we explore the romantic side of Tudor England, even if that romance could prove deadly. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 103, The Tudors in Love with Sarah Gristwood. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast. Sarah Gristwood, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Jolly good. It's glad to have you back. You were on the podcast before talking about Lady Arbella Stuart, and today you're here to talk about the Tudors in Love and the wider conversation around that, going way back further into history. Before we get into that, though, a few questions to get to know you a little bit better. Could you provide me with a short introduction into your background? So what you do full time, where you grew up, that sort of thing.
Well, now I guess I write full time, but for many years I was a journalist, and a film journalist at that, interviewing Hollywood directors and actors in the end, which sounds glamorous and it had its moments, but in the end it did feel a bit like not a job for a grown-up. It was, however, extremely useful for what I'm doing now, because making the reader not mind that we don't know what Arbella Stuart was doing, really, for the entire 1590s, requires about the same writing skills as converting 15 minutes in a round table of 8 other journalists with Harrison Ford into a double-page spread in The Guardian. Strange, but true.
I can imagine. In my old life, I was in the media, but I was in the media events industry.
Oh, right.
By extension of that, I met many famous people over the years. And there is this curious thing, isn't there? People have this assumption that anything to do with the media, meeting celebrities, it must be intensely glamorous.
I know.
But invariably, it's the polar opposite, and invariably dealing with not very nice people.
I mean, the good bit was the travel.
Yes,
I did miss. But other than that, as I say, it's the writing skills I'm grateful for.
So, as I said at the start, we're here to talk about the Tudors in Love. And given that subject matter, I wonder if you could go back and witness a first meeting between a royal couple of history. What would you choose?
I guess, first of all, I say I'm not a romantic, so I don't even know if I believe in love at first sight. But maybe that's all the more reason why I'm going to go. I'm so sorry. It's a really, I'm sure, conventional choice, and probably a really boring one, but Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII.
Right.
Not because I think they necessarily clapped eyes on each other and fell wildly in love. In fact, we know that, Henry would have seen Anne at the masque of the Chateau Vert, and then he was about to have an affair with her sister Mary, So nothing happened for quite some time. So it wasn't a love at first sight. But all the same, I'd love, I think we all would, to get some sense as to what it was, particularly what it was about Anne,
About Anne.
because one can sort of see why Anne would have been interested in the king. I mean, it's like that old line, isn't it? So apart from the fact that he's the richest and most powerful man in the land,
Yes.
what attracted you to Henry?
Yeah, what attracted you to the multimillionaire Paul Daniels?
Precisely. But what was it about Anne that made her so appealing,
Yeah.
so interesting to Henry?
Yeah. I thought you were going to say Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville.
No, no. I agree it's a very interesting one, or the stories we have are interesting, romantic, courtly, whether they really bear much, I almost said any, but I won't say any, much relation to the truth, who knows? No, I think because we can understand the dynamics of that relationship, the relationship as it went on, but there are so in a sense, once they'd met and married, one feels one knows what's going on to a degree, whereas with Henry and Anne, you don't.
And if you had the opportunity to ask Elizabeth I a single question, what would it be?
Oh dear. Again, I'm sure I should come up with something both interesting and more kind of PC friendly. But I regret to say, when I was writing a book years ago about Elizabeth and Leicester, there was just one question everyone asked me, from my 10-year-old niece to other journalists to the man who came to mend the washing machine, and it was, did they or didn't they?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I dare ask Elizabeth that, actually. Also, I'm fairly sure she'd have a number of good answers, which didn't get one that much further to the truth.
Answers.
Yeah, I guess it's that. Sorry to lower the tone of the conversation this early in the podcast.
No, that's quite all right. And apt, because of the conversation that we're having today, Elizabeth and Robert Dudley's relationship will no doubtably come up later. You wrote The Tudors in Love during the pandemic. I believe it was a pandemic book. So introduce it for me. What made you want to tell this side of not just Tudor, but history full stop?
I guess I've always had a fascination with the idea of courtly love because it's so powerful and so enduring, from the 12th century. And I'd say still affects our ideas of romance today. I think I probably blame Vanessa Redgrave. The movie Camelot, which I'll have seen at an impressionable age in the Folkestone Odeon. I came at it from the angle of the Tudors. But again, there are so many questions about their various romantic or quasi-matrimonial, quasi-sexual relationships. And I came to realise that, in a way, this strange, bizarre, but fascinating creed answers those questions in a way nothing else quite can.
And you've already touched on it very briefly there, but a huge aspect of the book centres around this notion of courtly love. Now, it feels like something that is very fluid, almost ephemeral to pin down. How would you describe courtly love?
Well, you're right about the fluid, absolutely. But the core image is that kind of romantic, in the broader sense one, of a knight kneeling at the feet of a lady. And we've all seen that one. It's totally embedded in our culture to the degree that conventionally a man still goes down on one knee to propose today. Theoretically, anyhow. The core dream was that of a man. It was created out of a number of social conditions, one of which may well have been in the medieval castle at the time of the Crusades, the extreme imbalance of the sexes, lots of men, very few women. So the idea is that it's a lover in service to an adored and possibly unobtainable lady. Now, say that today, and it sounds pretty silly, frankly. But there was something about this that gripped the idea of the imagination of the European aristocracy for centuries.
And again, you've sort of hinted at this, but the term courtly love, it does tend to immediately conjure an image set in the 12th century. Perhaps you have a beautiful maiden high up in a tower. She's reading a poem produced by this love-struck admirer. Why is this vision of courtly love the one we tend to land on? Is it Eleanor of Aquitaine, the troubadours? Is it that?
Where it begun, and of course I think part of its power is that it did give women at least the illusion of power, a kind of emotional, cultural, if you like, authority at a time when really they often had very little indeed. But it was, as you say, born originally out of the songs of the troubadours, but really coming to fruition in the court of Marie de Champagne, the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, by her first marriage. And there, Marie commissioned the poet Chrétien de Troyes to write down for the first time the story of Guinevere and Lancelot. Arthurian stories around forever, of course, but believe it or not, this is where this story actually kicked off. And Chrétien totally went to town. He described, and it's bizarre and interesting stuff, because he described this love, although it was adulterous. I mean, we've got King Arthur's wife and King Arthur's best friend having it off, and Chrétien makes no bones about this being a physical relationship. But nonetheless, they're not reviled, blamed, rejected. They're admired for the strength of their ardour. And there's almost a religious element in it. Lancelot finds a comb of Guinevere's discarded by the road with a few of her hairs caught in it and worships it as if it was a holy relic. He genuflects when he leaves Guinevere's bedroom as if it were a religious shrine. I mean, today you would urge him to seek professional help, and that fairly quickly. But somehow this bizarre but incredibly potent image, worked.
Something else that I would like to ask you about is also in the following century and thereafter, we also then have a much bigger explosion in poetry, the likes of Chaucer also coming through. How did the church deal with this notion of courtly love? Did it struggle between these sort of schools of thought?
Yes, it did. I mean, ironically, the second person, also at Marie's court, we think, who wrote about courtly love was Andreas Capellanus, Andrew the chaplain. But he may have been sending it up to some degree. From some of the things that he wrote, perhaps, he was laughing at it a little, just the way the writers of Camelot the musical were, many centuries down the line. But the church did have problems, yes, absolutely. Because this, on the one hand, courtly love was hopefully, the idea was promoting virtue, promoting, purity of spirit and so on. On the other, it was setting up the love between man and woman as, something, another kind of moral authority, and it was promoting adultery. You can't get away from it in the end.
So to jump forward slightly, and we've touched on this couple already, but the love story of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, it's one of the most famous and perceived to be genuine love stories in English history. The writers of the age and later tell us varied accounts of how the couple met, but would you say they are the very definition of courtly love in some respects, given that if this meeting went as it's believed, that Elizabeth is by the roadside, Edward falls in love with her on the spot. It's courtly love all tied up, isn't it, really?
The stories are, the received version of the meeting of Elizabeth and Edward is absolutely kind of the ultimate core courtly love. You've got meeting on May Day, May Day very important in the courtly calendar. You've got Elizabeth, when Edward, seemed to threaten her virtue, holding him off even with a dagger, thus demonstrating the nobility of worth not birth that was part of the courtly creed. You've got that whole kind of, her saying that if she was not good enough to be his wife, she was too good to be his mistress. Anne Boleyn, N.B., Jane Seymour too, actually. The question is whether the stories are true. There are some problems about the timing. I mean, I won't go into all of it here, or would be there for the entire hour. But the timings of the story would be a problem. Other tales say rather more plausibly, though less romantically, that they actually met at court, after Elizabeth's father had been returned to favour. But even then, that doesn't make the core point go away, because even if it didn't happen that way, Edward's propagandists felt it worthwhile saying that it had. They were using all those courtly tropes in order to give plausibility and authority to what was, by the standards of the day, actually, seriously a mismatch.
Yes, and I think, but that there in and of itself tells us that this was, I believe, a genuine love story. I think because of that sheer disparity in rank. I mean, Jacquetta obviously was very noble, but married scandalously lowly in her second marriage. But that is, they are to me certainly one of the genuine love stories of history.
Yes, I totally agree with you that it's a genuine love story, but love has many faces.
Totally.
They, unlike most courtly lovers, and to their credit, did manage a long and happy marriage, which isn't something the courtly love story always provides. Well, witness Henry and Anne Boleyn.
And chivalry is clearly, without wanting to be too black and white about it, is the masculine side of courtly love.
Totally. Yeah.
How would this manifest? You highlight in the book Anthony Woodville, for example, was a key example of sort of chivalric behaviour.
And of course, there was this revival. By the late 15th century, we are effectively already talking a revival of courtly behaviour rather than the original unadulterated thing. Well, chivalry, we see it, as you say, boys with toys, forgive me, in the rules of the tournament and so on. But yes, and Anthony Woodville did make a number of chivalric stories, how the ladies of his sister's court pounced on him and, thrust a piece of paper into his hand and a garter around his leg, demanding that he defend such and such honour. I think for men, the chivalric side was chiefly in those rules of warfare. Chivalry, in the sense of it being rules for a man applied to women, it was always a fairly patchy business. In that book I mentioned, written by Andreas Capellanus, Andrew the Chaplain, he laid down a number of rules of courtly love. How the true lover must obey his mistress in all things, this, that, and the other. But though one of them is try to avoid lying completely. But one thing he says in the book is he's telling a lover, and by implication a knight or near offer, that they have to treat this woman almost as a goddess. This is this lady. I'm quoting from memory, but he says, if you happen to fall in love with a woman from the lower orders, however, an element of force may be necessary. So much for chivalry.
To get to Henry VIII, obviously he's a big part of the story here. Henry is, unlike his brother Arthur, Henry is raised among the women. He's raised by his mother and alongside his sisters. Things obviously change when Arthur dies, but Henry's early life is heavily dominated by women. Do you think this will have fundamentally changed his approach to romance?
Yes, I think that would have been one of the factors that definitely did. And we do know that his mother, Elizabeth of York, had read the Arthurian romances. There's her signature, Elizabeth the King's daughter, in books in the Royal Library, books of Arthurian tales. And of course, Henry loved all sorts of games playing, didn't he? All that dressing up as Robin Hood and so on later. But this romantic ethos had actually been started also by Henry's father as well. Heaven knows we don't think of Henry VII as a romantic man, but no, and I'm quite sure he wasn't. But he picked up the old Arthurian stories, not the Lancelot and Guinevere, but King Arthur and the Round Table and so on, in order, I guess, to legitimise his rather fragile new dynasty. What, the Tudors jumped up Johnny's come lately? How dare you? They were King Arthur's own heirs, and they had the family tree to prove it. So really, it was coming at a young Henry VIII from a number of different angles, but I think he was a very receptive boy, a very receptive vessel for all these ideas. He was, you can see a number of times in his life, the famous 6 wives, you can repeatedly see him trying to justify whatever it was, whatever as we now look back and think it was a monster. His own idea, in his own head, I think he had to be someone who was always doing the right thing, who was going ahead on the moral high ground. And the ideals of courtly love gave him a chance to do that, gave him the flag he could march under, if you like.
And I think we see that almost immediately, don't we, with his reign, because upon becoming king, one of the very first things he does is to marry Catherine of Aragon.
Absolutely.
It's very Arthurian. Do you think he genuinely saw himself as Catherine's saviour?
Yes, of course, he probably was Catherine's saviour at that point. She'd had a very tough time indeed for the last few years of Henry VII's reign. But yes, I think he did, and I think he loved that, because it wasn't just that he slowly orchestrated a marriage, was it? He swooped in practically the minute he'd been declared king, and rescued her from this life of poverty. And I think he loved seeing himself do that. He loved playing the hero. He was never even later going to be prepared to see himself as the villain. And again, I think those ideals helped.
Yeah. And I think with Henry, Henry is fundamentally, I think, misunderstood in many respects, because we later think of him as the great obese, and that he became the whole throwing chicken legs over his shoulders and everything like that. It's utter nonsense. Henry was actually, I think, a king who was terrified of being embarrassed. His court he wanted order and was very particular. And I think that his desire for his court to be ordered, to be a place that wasn't utterly frivolous, actually, it all does stem from this desire to be seen as chivalrous, doesn't it?
I think it does. I think he was desperate to stand well in his own eyes, as well as the eyes of the world. So I agree. The ideas of chivalry really did suit him to a T.
And obviously, we cannot get away from discussing Anne Boleyn. She's
Or would we want to?
well, exactly. It was so funny. I saw Tracy Borman
Oh, yes.
a few months ago, and she said, "I wish I could remember a day where I didn't mention her name."
Oh, funny. I do have days when I don't mention it aloud, certainly,
Yeah.
largely because there's a rather large dog sitting here, if you suddenly hear, and curiously enough, he's not that interested, but neither are a number of people I know. But you can't get away from her, can you? You can't get away from the idea of the fascination. And in this context, as you say, absolutely. You look at those love letters Henry wrote to Anne, and particularly what we think of as the earlier ones. It's like textbook courtly love stuff.
Mm.
Yes, he's the king, but he's her humble servant. The heart, the hugely important courtly love symbol, that little heart drawn at the bottom of so many of the letters.
Yeah, with their initials intertwined. Is it? Yeah, I mean, it's schoolboyish, isn't it?
I know. Yes. Well, there are times, in fact, in the court. I often feel thinking about courtly love, where you do rather think of teenagers, of high school sweetheart stuff. But I think also, I believe Henry liked the idea of Anne's. Well, he was pitching. Poor old Wolsey was having to tell the Pope and foreign ambassadors that Anne wasn't a foreign royal or a major noble, but she had, again, that nobility of worth. Her virtues made her worthy to be queen.
Yeah.
And I think Henry liked that idea. Of course, Anne, as we now believe, was leading him towards ideas of religious reform from complete conviction, not just from convenience. But again, I think Henry will have admired that. It will have made him eager, made him feel it right and appropriate, justified his being her suitor, her servant.
Yeah. And she is undoubtedly, I think, the most consequential woman in his life. I would like to ask you about Anne's time at the court of Margaret of Austria, her later time in France. It's seen as very fundamental in the shaping of her character. How did the courts of Europe differ when it comes to courtly love? And then do you think that actually we know that a big part of that foreignness was quite alluring to Henry VIII when it comes to Anne Boleyn. Do you think also that experience of courtly love stemming from somewhere else also sort of added to her appeal?
It's a really interesting question. And the answer is yes, absolutely. But as you say, she was at Margaret of Austria's court, where those games of courtly love were being played. The difference is, I think, that the continental courts, they were a bit further down the line than the Tudors were. They were a bit more knowing about the game. Margaret of Austria wrote poems, like a little poem for her ladies, about how lovely it was to hear men's flattery, but trust in their words and you'll find you've been deceived. When she went to France, again, I mean, it had been in Burgundy, it had been in those courts, and the courts of France, that the ideas of courtly love had really developed. So again, I think the game was played deliciously. The difference is, I rather suspect that on the continent, they knew it was a game. It was the Tudors, and particularly Henry, who took it so seriously.
And because of that, the ability for it to go wrong quite quickly, I suppose, was more present than it would have been in Europe. During Henry and Anne's courtship, as you've already said, it's the very definition of the game of courtly love. Can you talk me through a couple of the gifts that are exchanged and the symbolism there and things like that?
Oh, I know. Well, and it's all about wordplay, isn't it? He sends her a heart, by which he means a deer he's shot and killed, venison. But it's the heart. There is that pun on words. She sent a gift to him. We don't have it, but we've read the descriptions of herself as a figure tossed on a stormy sea, waiting for that rescue. And also, there's the sea. The idea of shipwreck as love is quite important in the courtly tradition. So, and you can see it even in things like the writing desk at which Henry probably wrote some of those letters. All this imagery of hearts, of cupids, of famous lovers. Are there any gifts that you're thinking of particularly?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. I mean, I know that during their marriage, I think she a New Year's gift of some very elaborate spears that he could then go hunting with and things like that.
Oh, that's right. Yes, indeed. No, there's so much kind of allegory behind all the Tudor gifts, isn't there?
And obviously, upon becoming queen, Anne's position is immediately and fundamentally changed. As queen, she has to be chaste, but she has to be accessible. She has to be gregarious, but also restrained. Would you say that the rules of courtly love therefore placed an almost impossible contradiction on how queens should behave, and in particular, a queen who would come up in the way that Anne Boleyn did?
Yes, I think they placed a restriction on the way a wife should behave. Okay. To me, that's the great weakness, the great danger of the courtly love game idea as it was originally played, that it really didn't work with a loving marriage. Of course, at the time and in the circles where it began, you didn't necessarily expect to find love in your marriage. Marriage was a matter of Marie de Champagne was theoretically asked to rule on whether true love in marriage was even possible. Mm-hmm. And she said that no, it wasn't, because marriage was a matter of family arrangement and true love was a matter of personal feeling. But that had changed a bit by Tudor times. Henry writing a song, "I love true where I did marry." But all the same, I think on the one hand, this has been the problem for Catherine of Aragon. Courtly love was never really equipped to deal with the realities of a long marriage. The lady getting older, the disappointments of childbed. But for Anne, once she became queen, her first duty was to produce an heir. But other duties, as you say, they didn't really fit with that demanding, capricious, courtly tradition. Mm. I suspect, this is what I'd really love to know, that up to a point Anne didn't realise or accept to what degree the rules changed when she became queen, wife and queen. Mm. I suspect that she still went on trying to play the game. After all, as you say, that's what had brought her up. Yeah. It wasn't as if she was a foreign princess who'd been married for a huge dowry. So I think she went on relying on them, but they were very much a broken crutch, a trap.
And I think that was also part of the inherent, I suppose, difficulty that both king and queen faced, is that these people were more than a person. They were the court made manifest in person, weren't they? So that constant ideal that certainly Anne would have had to have striven for because of how broadly unpopular she was would have been impossible to grapple with.
Yes. Well, as I think you're saying, that there were several different pressures, ideals pressing down on Anne, and the courtly love was only one of them, and perhaps the least safe here. There was the ideal of good queenship, good ladyship, of the moral high ground and the welfare of the country.
And she is, unfortunately, the blueprint of how courtly love can go disastrously wrong. And a sort of very notable example of that is the infamous scene with Sir Henry Norris in Dead Men's Shoes. If we accept it was said, then it does cross a major line in the 1534 Treasons Act. Things like that. Do you think that actually the unconventionality of Anne's story made her personally more susceptible to the dangers of courtly love?
It's interesting. I hadn't quite thought that through myself, but yes, I think you're right. On the one hand, she must know that that had been her appeal for Henry. And on the other, of course, when things started to go wrong, there wasn't any powerful European family waiting to make sure that Henry didn't take the ultimate sanction.
Yeah, and it's a funny one, isn't it? I think because a bit like Elizabeth Woodville, enemies of Anne that were constantly looking for there was always that, how did she do this? How did she, like Elizabeth Woodville, how did these women capture the king's attention? And so I think by
Yes.
their very nature of how they became queens, obviously much more dramatically for Anne Boleyn, made it much more believable when things went wrong.
Yes, I think in a sense, so many people will have thought that Anne was an accident waiting to happen. The unconventionality, as you say, and to many people, undesirability, more so than Elizabeth Woodville, I think, because, of course, Edward IV didn't have to put aside anyone to marry Elizabeth Woodville. And indeed, arguably, there could be a kind of reconciliatory value in his marrying a woman from what had been a Lancastrian family. Whereas with Henry, everything seemed against it.
Yeah.
But I agree, it did make her massively vulnerable and massively open to scrutiny. We're still debating, aren't we, just why Anne fell. But even if it were entirely a mixture of court factions, her disagreements with Cromwell, Henry's urgent desire for an heir, that flirtation in the Queen's chamber, all that courtly love material would still have been a weapon in Cromwell's hands. It would still have given colour to the idea of Anne as an adulterous lover. And right through to the end, I think, you see this playing out. On her way to the Tower, it's reported, Anne suggested that Henry was only trying to test her. Well, fat chance. But it is that testing, someone testing the lover or the lady, is a huge trope in courtly love.
And she is obviously famously executed by sword on the 19th of May, 1536. It is the only, to the best of my knowledge, recorded use of a sword. But that in itself has been seen by some as a form of chivalry on Henry's part, I believe.
Yes, but in what form? It has been seen as he still loved her on some level, so he wanted her to have the cleaner beheading with a sword rather than the potentially blunter axe. Jolly nice of him. But also, there's another way of looking at it, that the sword was a very important symbol in the courtly love tradition. Think of King Arthur's Excalibur. And so Anne was being beheaded by the weapon of the very codes that she'd used.
Sometimes I do wonder as well if there was an element here, because it was well known that it delivered a more assured, clean result than the axe, whether there was an element of Henry also quietly acknowledging to himself, I know this woman is innocent. And the reason I say that is because it is not a kindness that is given to Catherine Howard a few years later, when her adultery is far more assured.
Yes, perhaps. In fact, yes, probably. But I think we'd have to delve quite far into the levels of Henry's psyche. I don't think that...
Yes.
I doubt that he would have admitted to himself that she was innocent, because that would have cast him in a bad light in his own eyes. But somewhere down in the levels of his consciousness, unconsciousness, yes, very possibly, I think.
Yeah. And talking of Catherine Howard, she suffers the same fate by the axe instead. But how central do you think courtly love actually plays a part in Catherine's destruction? There is obviously that well-known letter to Culpeper, for example.
There is. I'm not sure it did to a huge degree.
Okay.
I think you see it again with Anne of Cleves, of course, where Henry tries to play a courtly game with her, going to meet her in disguise, and she fails. The eye of true love doesn't recognise him. But with Catherine Howard, I don't really pick that up from Henry's, anything we know of Henry's views towards her. There is, as you say, that letter to Culpeper, which may show her trying to play the game of courtly love and not doing it terribly well. I mean, you could say that Catherine Howard wouldn't know anything about courtly love, surely. She hadn't been very well educated. But the one thing we do know for sure is that she was taught music. And of course, music and song was a huge transmitter of this romantic ideal.
Like her mother before her, Princess Elizabeth, Lady Elizabeth, would also face some scandal in her teens, thanks to the behaviour of Thomas Seymour. Now, exactly what happened between the pair is highly debated. But would you say that, again,
Yes.
is there an element of courtly love
Yeah.
gone wrong here, or is it something far more insidious?
No, I'm not sure I would see it there. Unless it's as general as, Elizabeth being dazzled by this man who doubtless says, everything, all the right or the wrong things. No, I think Elizabeth was, in the end, the great utilizer, more so even than her father or grandfather, of these ideals. And to some degree, perhaps she wanted to believe them. But I'm not sure I'd see the Seymour thing as that. I think I see it as a bit more just plain old-fashioned, dark, yes.
And to briefly touch on Mary, Queen Mary I, rather like her grandfather Henry VII, she's repeatedly seen as rather dour, her court lacking in romance and frivolity. Do you think this is accurate? Did Mary openly eschew an atmosphere based on courtly love, or is that something we sort of are conditioned to believe?
I don't see Mary as being active or interested in courtly love as such, any more than Catherine of Aragon was. Catherine of Aragon played along with the games, but there isn't much evidence of her being an expert in the way Anne was. But in a more general sense, if you take this strange idea of affection, adoration, and courtly love as beginning to permeate into a more general kind of romance, then yes, because Mary adored Philip of Spain and adored him, the idea of him, even before they met. When she was saying how she wanted to marry him, she asked her counsel. If ordinary people are allowed to choose a partner, to their own affection, why can't sovereigns claim an equal liberty? To which the answer of the 16th century would normally have been no. But Mary did have this idea that there had to be love. She was prepared to love, she wanted to give and receive it. So perhaps in a more diffuse sense, yes, but not the actual courtly ideal, I think. After all, she'd have grown up as associating that with Anne Boleyn's court. So those would probably have been games she was careful not to play.
I suppose, ironically, there is also one suspects there is a certain romance in just her story being, this sort of a princess cast aside, perpetually on the shelf. There are suitors positioned left, right and centre, and then it's her herself. She decides who she will marry.
Well, in fact, again, I can't say I'd thought of that. But yes, I suppose, in a sense, her ability to decide it for herself is the kind of autonomy that the courtly lady theoretically could claim.
Now, Elizabeth's court is famous for its extravagance and its romanticism, ironic given that she famously never marries. But how in the early days of Elizabeth's reign did she invoke the rituals of courtly love as a means of legitimising her rule?
Well, I think the first shock of Elizabeth's rule was the degree to which it had to be legitimised. We do forget it a bit now because, as you say, we think of her as the Virgin Queen, we think of her as this icon, but the absolute assumption in the early days of her reign would be that she had to marry. Everyone was assuming it, foreign sovereigns, her own council. As a little bit of time wore on and it became clear that no, she wasn't going to, that she was going extraordinarily to remain a single female monarch, loving all the flirtatious stuff, the approaches from foreign princes, but never actually saying yes, then they needed a language, a code, if you like, to make this acceptable, respectable, and courtly love provides it to an extraordinary degree. Because again, you've got this figure of this in the courtly love, the image in everyone's heads. This lady, beautiful lady, standing with a knight with suitors kneeling at her feet. That's exactly the position Elizabeth wanted her suitors, her courtiers, well, pretty much every man in the kingdom, to be in. And I'm sure that suited her emotionally. It gave her huge pleasure, but it did also sanction her female rule in a way not much else could have done. And I mean, really, if you think about it, the rules of courtly love did fit Elizabeth to a T. The courtly lady was meant to be capricious, demanding. Yeah. Not exactly a problem for Elizabeth, was it? She was meant to have a huge amount of patronage at her disposal. Again, no one had more than the Queen. She was meant to be on the moral high ground so that her suitors, her lover, her admirer could benefit by her example. Well, Elizabeth, married by the coronation ritual to God, giving the moral lead to the whole country. You don't get much more uplifted than that. Yeah. And I always think of that picture of Elizabeth very late in her reign, but on the kind of litter borne by her courtiers, almost like a goddess, an image being carried through the streets.
I think it's fair to say that most people conclude that if ever there was a love of her life, it probably was Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. There's very few people would contradict that. He tries to convince Elizabeth to marry him on a number of different occasions, but most extravagantly in 1575, he lays on something known as the Kenilworth Entertainments. What was this, and what was some of the symbolism that he was using?
Well, some of the symbolism indeed did echo those goddess ideals of courtly love. And it was all about the symbolism. I mean, they said that even the clocks were set to strike 2 to suggest pairs, couples. But by then, I'm very interested in Robert Dudley. I suspect he wasn't a natural courtly suitor. Men like Christopher Hatton really went for it. And you knew absolutely that there was no question of actually marrying Elizabeth. But Dudley did have real hopes of marrying her. It's even possible that this Kenilworth Entertainment, which after all was 16 or 17 years into her reign and their courtship, that it was a kind of farewell gift, if you like. It was a kind of, because after all, as we now know, he'd probably gone through a form of marriage with Douglas Sheffield. He was about to marry Lettice Knowles. Yeah. I see him as someone for whom this game wasn't a natural. and who did have real hopes of something much more concrete at first. I think later suitors, people like Hatton, Raleigh played the game. The Earl of Essex, Leicester's stepson, for heaven's sake, I think they really saw it as a game and a ritual they had to go through. But I guess maybe by now the ritual of courtly love, it was getting to be a bit of a game and a bit divorced from reality. Or maybe it had kind of gone sideways, maybe
I think also
the romantic ideal of marriage was coming up a bit. But all this Essex, who was many years Elizabeth's junior, her first suitor's stepson, who would lead a rebellion in the end to try and possibly topple her from her throne, that he still writes all this stuff about wanting to conquer her resisting will and her windows being the poles that will guide his ships home and stuff. I think by then the game was getting a bit overblown and a bit degraded.
I think what makes Robert Dudley so interesting and stand out from the other favourites over her reign is that he was more of a constant, and this was actually a relationship that was not defined by her being queen. It was a relationship of life, and it therefore has, I could almost slightly compare them to Charles and Camilla.
Interesting. Oh, that is interesting. To me, I think Robert Dudley was almost the closest thing she had to family, because she was remarkably short on really close relatives. She favoured
Elizabeth, didn't she?
Yeah, quite. I do see it as a kind of long marriage in a sense, even though they never went through the form of marriage. But no, I think he was, as you say, an absolute constant in her life, which is why she was so devastated when he died.
Well, the fact that she kept that last letter and it's inscribed his last letter, it's very telling, isn't it?
I know it is. And I do also think that part of the indulgence she gave to the Earl of Essex was because of her love for Robert Dudley. Essex was Dudley's stepson and in some ways surrogate successor. And Elizabeth did indulge him to an extraordinary degree for many years before finally being forced not to.
Yes.
I think that is a kind of tribute to her love for Robert.
Yeah, I would agree. And a huge turning point, actually, in what brings Essex down is when he bursts in on Elizabeth and she's famously doesn't have the mask of youth and everything on. That, in and of itself, as Elizabeth aged, her imagery became ever more removed from reality as well. You've got sort of a courtly love becoming ever more removed from reality in exactly the same time that Elizabeth herself is changing. So her imagery then began to take on strong allegorical components. How was this done? Did it all tie back to sort of romantic ideals? There was a huge use of pearls and things like that, right?
Yes, there were the symbols of virginity. Well, she and her courtiers, her image makers, used a number of different iconographies. There was the one of the Vestal Virgin, the famous sieve portrait referring to the Roman Vestal Virgin who proved her chastity by carrying a sieve full of water without spilling a drop. There was this conscious attempt to, if you like, set her up as an equivalent to the figure of the Virgin Mary. There was reference to both to biblical heroines and to heroines of classical mythology. But there wasn't very direct reference to those courtly figures in her iconography. There wouldn't be if you think that her mother had been executed because of them. And Elizabeth was very determined to prove her virginity. But the whole ethos, you can see it's absolutely there in in the pictures, in the poems, Spenser's Fairy Queen, to give just one example, and in that kind of posture of adoration that all these men were required to adopt.
And we can't also escape the fact that this is also the very point at which Shakespeare is
Indeed, yes.
fundamental to Elizabeth's court, the notions of courtly love. And you write, to sort of to conclude, you write in the book that there is also maybe a sense that Shakespeare was laughing at the notions of courtly love.
Well, I think you can. Yes, I think he both used them and made gentle fun of them. Chaucer did the same, of course.
Yeah.
You can very often people see intelligent men and women, on the one hand, having this dream in their imagination, because it is a powerful dream, and on the other, being aware of seeing the foolish side of it. So yeah, I think it's both there in Shakespeare, like practically everything else.
Yes. And so my final question, you mentioned in the postscript that it could be argued that the Tudors gave us a version of courtly love that we still use today. So I wondered if you could expand on that.
I think by and large what happened over the centuries was that courtly love, much of it, did become a more generalized idea of romantic love. But it's still so romantic love, as in ideally in every romance novel ending in marriage rather than being adulterous as once it was. But a number of the tropes remained. The idea of, love at first sight, of total love, of the man on his knee, the man as the protector and the gentleman as protector and servitor of the lady. But
even specific flowers when you give flowers, even specific roses and things like that, it all ties back, doesn't it?
Precisely. Yes. And today, I think what's interesting is how many of those actual patterns that we see right back in the 12th century do survive. When I swear I won't try and hum it to you, but there can't be many people who hear Giorgio Moroder, Electric Dreams, and think of Dante seeing Beatrice. But I promise you, if you look at the lyrics, it's there. That advert, that old advert for a man leaping off a ship, swimming through dangerous waters to bring his lady love her heart's desire. Yes, and all because the lady loves milk tray. Even things like in films. My favourite historical film ever has to be A Knight's Tale.
Really?
And yes, and they send it up, but they're using but they also admire and respect and that after all, that's a real love story in the end on screen. But they are using things. In the 12th century, Chrétien de Troyes had Guinevere, Lancelot saying to Guinevere, I'll win this tournament to prove my love to you. And her saying to him, no, lose this tournament, and that way you'll really prove your love. They do exactly the same thing in A Knight's Tale. And the lyrics of Camelot, time and again, I could go through the 12th century writings saying, oh yes, that's where that comes from. Yeah. Don't know whether Lerner and Lowe and the authors of A Knight's Tale had been reading their 12th century writings, but they seem to have got them somewhere, even if it's percolated through the Victorian revival.
Yes. Well, thank you very, very much for coming on and having this discussion. This has been really fun. I knew this would be a good one because it's lovely to talk about a subject that is so central to history, but we don't necessarily examine it for what it could be. So what are you working on at the moment, if you're allowed to say?
Well, I have another book coming out in October, but it's not specifically a Tudor one. It's an anthology. I did an anthology of women's diaries that came out last
I
year.
remember.
And this is an anthology of women's quotes, of celebratory quotes, both direct and indirect, expressing them, through food, fashion, fun, friends, family, and so on. I am working on another Tudor book, but I haven't yet sent it to my agent, let alone my editor, so perhaps I'd better not say. I like to think of it as a missing link in the 16th century story, as well as some familiar faces in there.
Well, that sounds very exciting. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much again for coming on the podcast, and hopefully we'll speak again at some point soon.
I hope so. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Sarah for coming on to the podcast for a second time, and my thanks to you, the listener, for tuning in. If you have any suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do drop me a message on Instagram at the Tudor Chest. If you enjoy these episodes, then perhaps you would consider becoming a subscriber to the channel, where I release a weekly subscriber-only podcast episode as well. You can sign up to that either via Apple Podcasts or on Patreon. Thank you again, and speak to you next week.